right, hi there everybody. It's about time, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the last presentation of the day. My name is Jennifer Lim, I'm with Sprint. My subject is gaining support for Hadoop in a large corporate environment. This is not a technical presentation, it's more about how did we start, getting into Hadoop and where are we now. So really briefly talks about our 3-year journey. I find a lot of customers, especially in other enterprises, are, how did you bring this new thing in? How did you integrate it into your architecture? What success did you have? And so this presentation is really about that. We'll talk about the team, the research challenge and what we learned, and then really the key thing was how do we move out of research from Hadoop being a research project and make it as part of the enterprise architecture. All right, real quick about me. I've been at Sprint for over 14 years now. I started in data management, but really have done a variety of jobs in network, finance, marketing, the research lab, always with analytics. That's my background. Sprint is one of the major telecom companies. Please use our service, right? The interesting thing is that we have lots of data. So for us, big data is something that we've been dealing for years and years and years and years and years. But what we found recently is the new technologies, especially around Hadoop, allows us to do deeper analytics, keep more history. So we're doing different use cases than we could have before. All right, so this is interesting. I have given this talk several different times, and I noticed when I put together this slide, when I was talking about the team has even changed since we first started. I say first, 2011. The team was really a group that it started as the Advanced Technology Lab, and they were doing things, writing patents around technologies, specifically around the network. And what they did is they came in and they said, okay, research team, you're great at what you do, but we want you to stop doing what you're doing. We want you to use the data that you've been using to test out your scenarios, use that data, take it, and find some new use cases. We're hearing all about this data gold mining thing. Go and figure out what we can do. What the team was focused on at the time, and a lot of us are still here, the data research scientists, right? RF engineers, they primarily worked in mobile internet research. Security and privacy was a big one. Location, we were doing a lot in network research. But what I found as I was writing the slide for this presentation is I actually added on a couple more capabilities that the lab has really become responsible for. Architecture research. So as we've taken on new responsibilities, been doing the data analytics, we've had to figure out the architecture. What worked, what didn't work, that kind of thing. So it's a role that the lab has taken on. And prototype development. We are doing so much prototype development around the new architectures, around demonstrating the value in the data, that I really felt like it was something that should be added onto the skill sets. Now this team, you'll see kind of up in the right, I've added some time frames to give you an understanding of when some of these happen. The team is really repurposed in the summer of 2011. So that's really when we were given the challenge and said, hey, go find what's valuable. So what I'll do is I'll talk about how we went from using the data from an optimization, what the research idea was, what was our realization, what were our learnings and so on, and really our overall goal is to create actionable insights. So just to give an understanding of our environment, historically our data is used for optimization tasks. So this is where we were a few years ago. So network data we use for capacity management, looking at call blocks, drops, that kind of thing. Roaming, a big study area. We use it for customer care, so port ins, port outs. We do have, if you heard the keynote, telecoms have some of the largest databases. We just have a lot of data. We do have, prior to the work that we'd been doing the last 3 years, we were doing very simplified forecasting. Everything was based on sampling. We just couldn't handle the volume. Now we don't have to do that anymore. We do still some sampling, but we're able to do full volume. Our skill sets that we were using at the time, we have a lot of RF engineers, computer engineers. Again, we were looking at optimization, a whole lot of project managers. Our analysts were using spreadsheets, so our business analysts, simple forecasting, and all of this has gone through a change since we've been using the new technologies. So the research challenge, right? So just the general, find new use cases, right? Find insights available nowhere else. Well, thanks, you know. There's small tasks there. One of the first things that we did is we went through and we did a catalog of our data. So what is special in our data? What can we find within our data? And this is what we came up with. We basically categorized it. So we can tell with device usage what applications people are using. We can tell social networks, so graphs, who's talking to whom, how frequently do they talk, that kind of thing. We can use XDRs. A lot of times you hear them as the metadata records, so IPDRs, CDRs, texting records, all of that kind of stuff. Location was something that's in our, we have to be able to route the call, route the text, right? So location is available in our data set. And then also websites visited. So what websites do people go to on their devices? So what we did is we went through this and we said, okay, well, we have this challenge. What are we going to start with? What we decided to start with was location. So for us, if we looked at all the web companies and the data that they were using, one of the things that we thought they were all trying to find was location. Everything that they're trying to get people to adopt is to try to figure out where you are. We know that. So what can we do with it? So by October of 2011, we had our first proof of concept. These are actually some graphics that were developed from that. And really, this is where you start to see the transition from optimizing the network to starting to ask questions. What can we do with the data? These are actually graphs that were done for a conference. What we used for cell phone location detection. And we said, of the people at the conference, show us some insights. Show us some interesting graphics. So the bottom one, the lower one, is actually a heat map to show you where people were located from. Another interesting one, so this was a conference in Las Vegas. So an interesting one to look at was last night's location. So where were they last night? What casinos were they staying on? We actually found a use case for this where we were actually able to segregate the data between employees, so you could see the traffic patterns that went out of the strip and those that were staying, so most likely the travelers. Another thing that we did was something that we call home location, which maps somebody to their home market and says, okay, the people at this conference, what was their home market? That had interesting use case applications through, well, if I'm having a travel conference and 40% of my people came from Orlando, maybe I market in Orlando, right? The real purpose here was just to demonstrate to people you could do this, right? We could process the data, we could process the traffic. These are not complicated visualizations, but there's a lot of information you can get from them right off the bat. And again, 3 months. So, what did we learn about our infrastructure? We couldn't use the current enterprise infrastructure. That was our first thing. One, we were a research lab. We had no IT funding. I don't know about you guys, but if you work in a large enterprise, if you don't have an IT project, you don't get resources. So there were no IT resources on the project. So we didn't have any funding. It was, go do this. There was no, and here's your blank check to go buy whatever you want. No, that didn't happen. We needed something that could store a lot of data without a lot of prep. What we were actually using something called CDRs, or call data records, and a lot of traffic. And what we wanted to do is just study it. What does it have? What can we do with it? So we didn't want to go through a typical warehouse. If you think of a typical data warehouse, it's all about transforming the data, making it perfect or pretty. We didn't want to do that. We wanted the raw data so we could go and find the insights. And we wanted to be able to experiment. So we went to Hadoop. It was a great place to load up the raw data, have tool sets to be able to use it, and allow us to work with the data and figure out what we could do with it. Likewise, our current lab infrastructure couldn't be used. If you think back to what I said of what we were doing at the time, we were doing things like creating new device software that would go out test it, and look for those certain events to see what was generated on the network. We were looking for specific events within the data stream. We weren't looking to load up the entire set of data for a week and go mining. It was a completely different way to use the data than we had done previously in the lab. So what we had available before and the skill sets we were using didn't apply. And then, so what did we do? This is a literal. What we did was we looked around, went into a closet, found some servers, dusted them off, and went out to the web, got the open source Apache Hadoop, loaded it up, and I'll put some stats here just to give you an idea of as we've grown. It was 5 terabytes. Our first servers were all memory, no disk. It was 5 data nodes, and we had 1 manager node. That's what we started with. Pretty small, and I think I heard that echoed in a few other presentations. It was small enough to manage, it was small enough to learn from. We've definitely scaled beyond that, but that's where we started. All right, so that was our prototype. Now, fast forward, what did we learn? So I'll talk about some of the analytics we've been doing, the benefits we found, data and infrastructure. So, new analytics. A lot of the new analytics we've been doing has been around network data. So this is the easiest visualization I like to go to. So what are we doing? New products, definitely. We're looking at how do we increase satisfaction, attract new customers. To create actionable insights is always the key thing that we try to do. And really, if you think about it, all the events that we get in that we could study are random chaos. It really is that left-hand corner. And what we do is we do all different kinds of studies. These are actually some of the visualizations from some of our studies about, again, what are the markets? How do the markets act differently? What are their cost structures? How do we do cost trending differently? What are mobility patterns? What are, using social graphs, how do people's communication patterns change by time of day? Things like that, all things that we're able to do now. Some of our benefits and some of the data. One thing that we didn't do basically at all before were external data sets. So something that we've gotten a lot better at is integrating new data sets. Thank you to our government for publishing data for us. But really, becoming comfortable with that. Bringing in external data sets was something that we hadn't done before. We did it in the lab, and now the enterprise has it in the warehouse. We have census data and other data that you can use to correlate with your insights. New specialized business rules. So when we were doing our prototypes, we have found things that then we rolled into the enterprise. So home location is an example of that, where we go and we say, okay, where is this person's home market? Prior to that, the most common way was to use billing zip code, which is great, except for this whole thing called e-bill, where we email you your bill. Well, your billing zip code doesn't give us much insight to where you're at if we're emailing your bill. So we had to come up with new ways of trying to determine where somebody's based out of. Geospatial, we've done a lot in geospatial. Prior to this, geospatial was really just used in like the real estate area, RF engineering. Now we use geospatial analysis, marketing, finance. If there's a way that we can put it on a map, we like to put it on a map. So that's been a really interesting change to see as people have migrated. And then new business intelligence and visualization tools. We are constantly evaluating and trying to figure out what are the right tool sets. Our underlying infrastructure is changing, so which ones do we do? One of the use cases, this is my beautiful clip art for y'all. This is an actual use case to demonstrate one of the, so I worked in marketing for a while, and we had this process that we would do for our mailers, and says, hey, we have a great new device, go to your nearest store. Well, we only have a so-so take rate on that nearest store. So what we ended up doing is we ran some studies and said, you know what? We actually find that people are going more frequently to the store near their work location or to where they're at during the day, as opposed to us suggesting that they go to the store nearest their home. Changed it, got an uplift, quite a big uplift in our direct mail take back. So again, a use case of being able to look at traffic, look at trends, look at rates, campaign mailings, that kind of thing to do and find difference in the business. All right, new infrastructure. So by June of 2013, so now we're in about a year ago, we had what we call the Franken cluster, where we just kept finding servers and adding to it and just, kind of piece parting it together. As of about last year, we were really getting into more, okay, we need to stop doing open source. We did a trial of several different distributions to figure out which one worked best for us. We saw that the enterprise was really starting to, come to this Hadoop idea. And so we needed to figure out what the optimal setup was for the enterprise, not for necessarily a research area. So what we did is we developed what we called our lab cluster. We use the cluster all the time. We still have it. We use it to train internal resources. We have what we call a big data user group. So that was a huge thing in getting people comfortable with the new technology. And we also, it's not just the research team anymore in this lab cluster. There's teams, I've listed some and some of the use cases that there are, but they're all doing different POCs in here. So usage-based cost, finance groups in there doing that, products in there doing, we get application data from some of our applications, Sprint Zone's one of them, where we can now get the raw data and we're doing our own transforms rather than relying on our vendor to give us our 5 metrics that they were willing to share with us. Network, we're doing location accuracy improvement is one of the studies that they're doing. Pathing analysis, so if you take a distinct event and you try to go backwards, marketing's doing work on that. Churn is always a big one for us. So if you take a churn event and you say, what were my last 3 events to that person, last 5 events to that person, and what are my trends, they're doing that. The device group, there's a group that does like the user interface design, and so there's a group that does behavioral analysis on that. They're doing some work. And also, Kara is doing some customer text analytics. So when we send out those surveys and we say, how did we do? Well, it'd be nice if we could study those results. So they're actually doing some results. And again, what we do, our approach, is we actually do this in our lab cluster. So we have all these different groups kind of experimenting with the technology, becoming more familiar with it. And then what we do, if we find it's a good use case, then we migrate them to our production cluster. That's how we've set up our area. So how big is this cluster? It's approximately one petabyte. Servers are 4 terabyte data drives and 256 gig RAM, and it's 30 nodes. So that's 23 data nodes, and there's management nodes and visualization nodes. So that gives you an idea of the size of that. All right, and now we also have an IT production cluster. So for us, this is stuff full scale, repeatable. IT supports it. And it just went in. So now we've gotten to the place where it's been really interesting to see all these different groups, these IT groups that, just even a year ago they were like, Hadoop what? And now all of a sudden we have all these teams of people working on this environment. It's been really interesting to see. So as I said, what we do is we use the lab cluster to kind of prove out, yes, this is the right technology, and then we migrate it. So proven use cases. So our footprint right now is just over 2 petabytes, and that's for the things that we've proven out. We've gotten the funding. We said, yeah, we're going to invest in this. We're going to put it in the production cluster. In this, we do have the IT processes and controls, repeatable data loading, things like that we don't necessarily have in the lab cluster. Standards are actually there. So the idea that things are named consistently and you know where to find the data and simple things like that in life we don't necessarily follow in the lab. And like I said, so when we first started, we were a team, depends on when you count, about 5 to 8 resources in the lab. That's what we started with the first POC. Now as I look around and I say, all right, there are over 5 teams, from hardware to software to security, all these teams that are now working on it. And to me, that's kind of the amazing thing and how they've all adapted to it. So similar kind of thing. This one is 52 data modes. And then we do add some other nodes for management and visualization. So this is a lot of the change that we've seen. And these are 2 pictures that we've drawn along the way. This is, if you look at the first one, current analytics architecture state, this is where we were. And this is, I hope we weren't the only one, but this was very typical where every analytics smart, every analytics system, every user group who kind of had their own use case had their own pipe leading to their own system and their own GUI, so their own visualization tools. What we're doing is we're moving towards the right-hand corner where we have the source systems, we have a collection, we can analyze, present, and then store it in the warehouse so we can get to the data before it actually gets stored in the warehouse. With the idea that we have a common collection and feedback loop instead of everybody having their own. So some of the changes that we've seen in the last couple years, even in the last 6 months. So with the Hadoop environment, we've moved to Agile, which we definitely were not before. So with the ability with the lab cluster, faster development cycles, we're dealing with like I said, text analytics, unstructured data is something that we're getting much more comfortable with. Now we have the scalable Hadoop, so we have billions of objects. The size that we have in our environments has gotten a lot larger. Partnering across the enterprise. So this one to me is very interesting with the big data user group, which I actually lead, so of course it's the coolest thing. But the idea that with having a centralized cluster, one of the benefits of that is that you have people using a centralized environment. And so we have people that are talking across the analytics groups that never spoke before. So in the same meetings, we have marketing, we have network, we have finance, we have product. These are I work in a large corporation. Before these groups were completely separated. If you remember that first, they had their own systems, they had their own way of counting their metrics, they had everything. So as we've consolidated and we've had more of a centralized environment, the willingness of some of these groups to talk, to share data insights, techniques, because we're all learning this together, has been a huge change for us and very beneficial. And that is my last slide. So with that, and it's good, we have some time for questions. And there is a mic.
Here I come, raise your hand.
Raise your hand and she'll bring you the mic so everybody can hear.
So as we approach this data lake mentality and ownership of the data seems to be really pressing on our enterprise, who owns the data and how do you open it up and make it available for everyone while keeping it safe? Do you guys have like a chief data officer or somehow to manage that ownership of information and data?
So our production cluster is an IT resource. So it's managed by IT under the CIO. We have certain data sets that are not shared. So we use a security software in order to keep some of it segmented so other groups can't see it, can't own it. It's not a marketing system owned. It is a centralized cluster that we're using. Okay.
In that user group that you have established, is there business users and IT personnel in it? And if yes, then why would business users be interested in what is being talked about by IT?
Yes. So the IT wall, we've had several discussions because the lab actually started under the CTO and we're actually under the CIO in IT right now. So that has been interesting. So the group actually started with just business users. I had actually come from, prior to being in the research lab, I came from the business side. So I had a lot of relationships where I was pulling people in. People were also interested in using the technology, and we said, well, if you want to use the technology, you have to come to this group to learn how to use it. So it really started as a business user group. IT found out about it, some of my IT peers, so I told them they could come, but they can't talk very often. So I try to keep it, I really do try to keep it as an analyst group, because once you get your IT peers in there, then they want to start solving problems. And I'm like, we're just talking, you know? So I really do the facilitation and the mediation between the groups. I'm joking a bit, but they are invited to participate. But I do try to still keep it more business focused. The people and the vendors that I invite to discuss are to teach them how to use the system and really enable them to do analytics. It's not about figuring out how big the cluster should be or if it should be up 24/7 or any of those. We have other meetings for those. So I do try to keep it very focused on the user group. Go ahead.
Okay, it's two questions. One very quick, but you say it's 4 terabyte servers, and then it's 52 servers, but you say it's 2 petabytes, so it's kind of like it doesn't add up for me. So if you could tell me.
So,
and the second question, just very quickly, could you expand more when you compare the distributions of Hadoop, and which one did you choose?
So the sizing, I purposely left generic. Some of our tech guys are here that I'm sure they'll answer some of the sizing, but I just left them generic. I've actually been working more on the use cases than watching the cluster grow, so that's why some of them are more generic and the math may not add up. What was the second question?
It's the Hadoop distribution evaluation.
So how do we do? So what we did is we actually, we had a lab environment where we stood them up side by side. So we did 2 different hardware configurations, and then we set the software on top of them, invited the vendors to come. We tried to do the installs ourselves, which we felt was important because we didn't want somebody coming in, making it work, and then we couldn't do it ourselves. So we actually did the installs. We ran it like a research project. So we do research charters, so we actually wrote out our process just like any other research project. And then after evaluate, and we had a series of things that we evaluated them on, went through the evaluation and then selected our partner. So, and have been happy since then with who we selected. But we went through an actual loaded up data, did the actual evaluation.
So I'm curious about what kind of legal and privacy hurdles have you guys faced, or discussions did you have about using the data that you're sitting on with location based?
Yeah, especially in the research lab when we first started. I remember saying at one point, you have an interesting job when you have the Office of Privacy on speed dial. So it was interesting. And really, I always say we were the CAN group. So we were going out and exploring the data and figuring out what we could do with it, which has really never been done. And then once we could figure it out, we would show people, and they're like, oh, you can do that with it? We had no clue. So what we actually ended up doing, about 2 years ago, we even caused a change in the terms and conditions that were published, just because legal found out, right, there were insights and valuable data within that we had no idea that was there until we started evaluating it. So we do constantly work with them to say, what should we be doing? Did you know this was in there? Did you know you could tell this amount? So that's why I call it, it's really good to have the research group, the CAN group, and then we figure out, okay, what are we gonna, do we do monetization? What can change with the enterprise groups and to have those discussions? But if you don't see it, you don't try it, you don't know it, trust me, before that we were, oh, our vendor partner, here's some data, right? If you don't know it internally, what assets you have in there, you're just opening yourselves up for problems. So we've learned a lot as we've studied the data and made everybody aware of it.
2 quick questions. What did you use to build your statistical models? And second, I've heard of the management nodes, the data nodes, but can you explain what a visualization node is?
So we're still struggling a bit with the stats. So we use MATLAB, we use SAS, we use R. We're even experimenting with MicroStrategy, which seems odd for me, but they have statistical packages within it as well now, so we're also trying to use that. We are using, a lot of what we're doing is we just take one function and we try it with a whole bunch of different tools and see what works. So that's on the stats. The visualization nodes. So with the tools, what we found is some of them, every tool integrates differently. And so some of the nodes we actually have to dedicate to some of the tools. And some of them say, yeah, we work in the cluster, but we'll take over your cluster, and that's the only thing you'll be able to do with it. Some of them are, well, yes, we work with Hadoop, meaning we can take data out of it and pull it onto our server. So it really is, you have to go in and understand exactly what the architecture is with the tool integration. Every single one of them is different. Every single one of them certifies at a different level. So some of them, like we went to 2.1 almost immediately because we were excited about the SQL capabilities. Our tools aren't there. So, I mean, some of them really vary that way. So it has to do with that.
Over here, Jennifer.
Yep.
Hi, thank you for the talk. When you were starting off in the research lab, how did you prioritize the use cases? Like to show the quick hits or the early successes. There's always more use cases than you can handle, and how do you show the opportunity and then get the buy-in for the larger stuff?
So when we started, so we did the data evaluation. We said, yeah, all this data is interesting, right? Our manager at the time had come from a web area, and she was very passionate about location. You gotta do a location. Everybody wants location. And so that really floated it to the top, and then we decided, well, what can we do with location? And that kind of took it from there. So it was really the research team. All of us kind of had different perspectives, and that's what made it work. Because really, it was such a generic task. Just go do something interesting. That's how we were tasked. And then show people that it can be done. And then after that, now it's constant. We could probably have 4 times the staff that we have and still not keep up with it, which is why we have things like the big data. We have to train people to do it themselves because we can't do it all. So that's why we have things like the data users group and trying to get the tools out.
Yeah, quick question. So did you find there any sort of core technologies that it was important for everybody to know well and to use, like Avro, for example?
I can't say. I mean, so what we found is we've all kind of found our niche. So like if somebody needs needs a certain area, and then one person kind of steps up and takes that on and then teaches the next person. We've had to do almost everything is training of internal resources. We didn't hire anybody with some super skill set, super Hadoop guy, right? We had somebody that said, hey, I'm interested in this. I've been playing with it online, and let me try and work with the lab cluster. So we really haven't, we just try to fill in gaps as we find them. Who wants to take on this new role or learn this new thing? And we have a great team that says, oh, I'll take it on, and we keep working with it. I would say for adoption in the enterprise, it's got to be SQL. So getting the capabilities to integrate with SQL, getting the tools to work, that's been the biggest thing. A lot of the enterprise groups, they don't want to change the GUI that they use. They want to use the same reporting interface no matter what it is. They don't care about the back end. Now they want more access to more history, and they want it to, do more analytics, but a lot of them, their desire to learn new interfaces is just not there. So we have to try and make the old tools work in the new way. Does that help?
Hi.
Hi.
So when you went from your kind of research project to your first funded project, I would imagine that was a pretty big milestone. You had to get somebody pretty senior to say, yes, I'll fund it. Could you tell a little about that?
So, yes. It was a big milestone. Like, this is actually turning into a real thing. What's interesting is for us, it ended up being, we could demonstrate with prototypes that it worked. And when we showed them, so now we're in the office of the CIO, right? And we showed them the price point of the difference between if you want 25 months of all of this history on our MPP system, it's this much. And if you want to go forward and invest in Hadoop, it's this much. And they're like, oh, let's have a conversation. So that really helps. But actually signing on the dotted line and seeing it come out of the Franken cluster kind of phase and seeing it really taken on, it was kind of a big, we're growing up kind of moment. So that's how it felt for us. So, and even getting, it was getting the actual IT production cluster was much harder to get that set up. Getting the other groups, the hardware groups, all of those groups, it seemed like that was much harder to just kind of get them on board. But it's been really interesting and kind of fun to see them kind of take and adopt it. And now they become the advocates for it. So now it's funny. We call it the snake oil, right? Because now when use cases come up, it's all the time. It's like, we should use Hadoop for that. We should use Hadoop for that. So it's almost gone the reverse kind of way where, well, anything, it can do anything, right? Well, no, we still have other components in the architecture. So that's kind of one of our running jokes.
Did you have a business sponsor?
Yeah, we did. We did have a business sponsor, and it was somebody that already had a close partnership with us, with the lab. So it was something where, when we said it worked and we could demonstrate that it worked, it was somebody that was willing to say, yeah, we believe in it, and we're willing to. Now, their path has not been, it definitely, if we would have gone in the warehouse as a traditional, it probably would have been done in half the time. But, I mean, they are over the moon with the capabilities that they have and the ability to store, even beyond what they thought they would be able to do with history and the kind of analytics they're doing. They were really the first, and then after that, they've just, now they're stacking up, so.
I'll ask the final question right
Okay, last question.
I wanted to ask about the adoption process from the time when you had the data into the cluster, and then you had more and more people using that. What was the process? Do they try some kind of test case they're thinking of, or are they coming up with a real business problem they were trying to solve? Or do they have lots of practice run and then eventually it leads to one application that goes to production? Can you tell about the cycle for them to convince themselves that it should go to the production cluster?
So how we've used the lab cluster, that's where we've done a lot of that. Sometimes people would just be like, I want to try new technology, but they wouldn't have a use case. We're like, well, what's your data set? What are you trying to prove? Because otherwise it would completely fall flat. Just saying I want to try something new, unless you're trying to find something, it just wouldn't go anywhere. But we really did use the lab cluster, and then what we do is we just work through the process with them. Okay, what are you trying to solve? What data set do you want to use? We'd get somebody to load it into the cluster, and then we'd go through. A lot of times they would, they'd come with ready to write HiveQL, right? And then it wouldn't work, and then we'd work through them a few iterations to get to show them. One of the things that I think helped, as I saw different groups doing interesting things, I would force them to come do show and tell at the big data users meeting. So when we saw, one of the really cool ones that I saw was texting while driving, which was how to determine if somebody was on a driving route. And we also saw text messages coming along. Could we tell if somebody was texting? It's a safety thing, right? But could we or couldn't we? It was just an interesting use case. So, just to get people's minds to say, well, you can do something besides a group buy, right? And to show different demonstrations, I think also helped to get people to think differently than just saying, well, I just want to store more history. Well, you could do a whole lot more interesting things in the cluster, and getting other groups to show that, I think really helped. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I hope you all have a nice evening.